Thanks, Owen, and great comments, Tom. Good afternoon. I'm Dylan Tanner, Executive Director of Influence Map, and thanks for the opportunity to speak at this great event. Firstly, I want to say how much we respect Reuters as a news organization, and we've had the pleasure of working with Reuters journalists around the world on various issues relating to climate. I think the media has a huge role and responsibility in robust coverage of both the COVID crisis and the ongoing climate emergency. We've seen a huge chorus of voices calling for a green recovery and to build back better. I don't like to be the Grinch voice in this, but we found that not everyone is in agreement with this agenda. And I'll present to you some data and analysis which shows that unless the positive pro-climate side is vigilant and deploys all its levers available to it, a green recovery may falter, or worse, some of the pre-COVID policy progress on climate could actually be reversed. Firstly, about Influence Map, we are a London-based think tank focusing on the climate emergency. Our role is to generate highly objective, data-driven content designed to shine a light on some key systemic blockages holding back much-needed action. We're nominally policy neutral and do not advocate, but work with more powerful levers in the system, institutional investors, campaign groups, climate-positive corporations, and importantly, the media. We have two core platforms, one analyzing how corporations are lobbying on climate policy globally, and another platform, Finance Map, which assesses the financial sector through a climate lens. So we've heard a lot recently about how the COVID crisis appears to resemble a kind of compressed version of the climate crisis. It's highlighted the need for science-based policy responses and the importance of global cooperation in response to global crises of these kinds. But more importantly, in my view, it's highlighted the central role of governments and the role they'll need to play in resolving these global issues. In particular, it's highlighted the need for and the importance of binding rules as how participants in both the real economy and financial sectors are allowed to operate. We've created a new platform amid the COVID crisis in response to stakeholders pushing for green recovery. It's called Recovery Map, released today, and it's designed to do two things. Firstly, amid the accelerated timescales in which the massive financial interventions are being deployed, it's designed to provide checks and balances on these processes. And secondly, to push for greater disclosure from governmental bodies making these crucial decisions which will impact our economies and lives for years to come. So we're tracking in real time two key issues which we think are very important and which will influence a green recovery. The first set of data that's absolutely critical are the corporate lending programs being undertaken by central banks around the world. And the second set of data are numerous attempts globally by corporations and their interests to influence existing and future climate motivated policy strands amid the compressed timescales in which governments are being forced to make decisions. And the two are intrinsically related. I want to talk about what our results show to date with each of these data sets and offer some thoughts on what needs to happen around them to facilitate a Build Back Better agenda. So as you know, central banks and governments around the world are injecting trillions of dollars into the financial system and the real economy in response to COVID to stabilize markets and provide bridging finance to citizens and companies until the crisis subsides. I want to talk about what the US Federal Reserve is doing, the world's largest central bank. This analysis could easily apply to all central bank interventions globally. Now, the Fed has authorization from the US Treasury to provide up to $750 billion in leverage finance in primary and secondary market support. This is a huge number and represents about 8% of all corporate debt in America. Primary market means direct loans and bond issuances, and secondary markets means bonds trading on exchanges or exchange traded funds. Now the Federal Reserve has seen its mandate expanded greatly since the financial crisis a decade ago, when it provided massive liquidity to financial markets amid the crisis. But these interventions were primarily directed at financial assets, which are fairly sector neutral, assets like government bonds or mortgage-backed securities. This new wave of interventions in corporate lending is directed at companies in the real economy. And this is where huge issues arise, which will have massive implications for a green recovery. Now, the chair of the Federal Reserve and the heads of the ECB and the Bank of England and other central bankers have all made strong statements about climate change and its importance to the system, to the economy and the financial system, and it should be a priority. But how they're going to make this a priority is not clear, as they have no such mandate at present to take policy stances on climate. But we argue that in making lending decisions of this kind in the real economy at a particular moment in time, they are in effect making value judgments as to which companies and which sectors should be assisted and by how much. Now, most central banks state their remit is to ensure the financial system remains stabilized, and they do not venture into decisions impacting real parts of the real economy. They do not yet have that authority, and the Fed and ECB are clear about this. But they are making these decisions implicitly by these calls on massive lending to real economy players. Last month, we put out a release which shows that the credit ratings of the energy sector in the United States, which consists exclusively of fossil fuel production and related services, has been in secular decline for the last 20 years, to an extent not seen by any of the other 10 sectors used by the financial system to describe the economy. It's highly likely from this data trajectory that the sector's credit ratings may not recover, and the decline is not in fact due to COVID. So in May, the Fed bought $1.3 billion of corporate bonds through the exchange traded funds, including $100 million of energy sector bonds. So this raises two questions. One, is it wise to accumulate risky assets in terminally declining sectors on the balance sheet of the US government? But also, is it intervening and distorting long-term market trends, importantly, that may disfavor a clean and green recovery? Now, there's been repeated calls for the Fed and the ECB and other central banks to explain clearly their strategies here as they inject massive amounts into real economy sectors, both in terms of how they're accounting for long-term non-COVID related trends in their interventions, but also to implement mandates to give central banks the power to address climate issues in the manner that they're making top-line statements on. So this is an important area for policy change by the governments who nominally control the central banks. So this is a perfect illustration of how these massive interventions are in fact policy decisions, and we welcome more pressure on the banks and governments who nominally control them to recognize this and take explicit action to match up this high-level rhetoric on climate with detailed action. I've described how central bank interventions are impacting the real economy and hence a potential green recovery. Around such decisions always come lobbying by vested interests. Relating to the Fed's lending, we have in fact seen US independent petroleum producers lobby to lower the Fed's rating threshold into non-investment grade credit, which is where many of these oil producers now sit. More broadly, we've tracked over 100 data points of corporate and industry lobbying on climate-related policy areas amid the COVID crisis. We described the results of this analysis in a media report released today. Sadly, most of this lobbying relates to opposition to climate measures and trying to roll back existing ones. Worryingly, we found the majority of these lobbying asks have been successful, roughly 65%. For example, in March, the US oil and gas industry lobbied the US federal government for a rollback on greenhouse gas reporting standards and other environmental issues, which are very hard to link to the COVID crisis. So it's clearly opportunistic lobbying, and they succeeded. The US EPA immediately granted their request. In Australia, where politics is already highly favorable to the fossil fuel industry, representatives of the oil and gas sector have taken up prominent positions on the government's COVID Recovery Commission and are pushing for massive subsidies for the development of gas industry in Australia. Similarly, in Europe, natural gas industry groups are pushing strongly for COVID-linked expansion of the role of gas. In Indonesia, the coal industry has been successful in securing wide-ranging deregulation amid COVID for its industry, including exempting coal miners from rehabilitation concessions. The automotive sectors in both the US and Europe have been lobbying for delays to emissions regulations and electric vehicle mandates. While all of this, while a lot of this lobbying is negative, in fact, the majority towards Paris-aligned policy, there is some positive action, especially from the renewables industry. The issue here is standalone renewable industry associations cannot match the lobbying clout of established groups like the American Petroleum Institute or the European Automotive Manufacturers Association. We've also seen and heard top-line statements from investors and groups of companies pushing for a green recovery. One thing we like to stress in our lobbying analysis is this top-line messaging is not enough to enact policy change. It needs to be accompanied by tactical positive lobbying from the company's own lobbying machines. And this includes powerful cross-sector industry groups, these same companies are members of, like the US Chamber of Commerce and Business Europe, and we're not seeing nearly enough of this. It's a very critical time with these central bank interventions, and climate policy decisions being made will have lasting impact. The fossil fuel lobbyists see this opportunity and are engaging with a detailed process in addition to the top-line rhetoric. So we say that stakeholders pushing for more Paris-aligned corporate lobbying, institutional investors, campaigners, and policymakers need to be highly vigilant as these things are changing in real time. So to conclude, there's a lot to play for in the next year to build back better, and my message is the details and detailed processes are all important. The influencing of these will determine the outcomes, and we hope our data tools rework to track things in real time will arm those pushing for a Paris-aligned recovery. Thank you.